Let's talk about JavaScript. ES6 modules. So, historically speaking, it was a bit complicated to create JavaScript files and then use them across other files. Something that sounds very trivial. It's been always a bit, I'm not sure if challenging is the right word, but at least very rudimentary. So maybe you heard about things like CommonJS or AMD. So there were several strategies towards mitigating the problem of exporting and importing JavaScript files. Actually, if we talk about the backend, probably you've noticed that the way you export files with Node is typing module.exports equals, right? You've seen that, right? So this is kind of legacy. This was the non-official-ish way to import and export files. So you export files that are like that, and then you import them using require, right? If you're working with task number 18 plus, you've seen that, right? So this is still the way to go with Node.js, even though they are theoretically planning to move away from that approach and just reuse the modern ES6 Plus standard to importing and exporting files. So let's have a look how to deal with that using modern JavaScript. So because we are using the Create React App ecosystem, under the hood, that tooling uses Webpack. You have a Webpack? So Webpack is an engine to bundle your assets and to perform some operations on top of it, right? So one of the things that Webpack is offering is the compatibility with import and export. So let's do an example. I'm going to create a new file. So the new file is going to be called player.js. That file will export default, look at that, function get data, for example. So what do I want to do here? Well, I would like to just return an object with some data, an array with some data. So name, Peter, score, 45, you know, just some basic details about the player, right? So let's display 3 players, 1, 2, and 3. Right, Peter, Mary, and John. So you've noticed that I've added export default prefix to my function. That's the way you can make whatever goes next, in this particular case a function, you make it available to other components. So other components can import that function and obviously play with it. How do they do that? Well, we can, from app.js, we can do import, and then the name of the function, get data, from, and then where is that file? Quotes.
Players.js.
Correct. /player.js. Technically speaking, the extension is not even necessary because Webpack will understand that this is a JavaScript file. But yes, of course, we can leave it, right? Because we're importing get data, we can invoke it, right? So this is a reference to the name of the function. So let's display the list of players with data score. How do we do that? With React. Get data. What else? Say it again? Name. Like that? The tags. What tags? A div.
Props in there, props.
Props.
Argument with.
Props. Right?
No, inside the
The tag. Right. This is a tag. And then what? Inside the get data, like that. How do we display an array of data in React, guys? Task number, I don't know, 13, 14. Player.name. No. That's not even part of the session. I was assuming everybody understood how to do that. No one? Cool. Please go back to CodeFlix and review how to display elements out of a list, right? So, yeah. We can use .map, right? Because this is an array of data. I want to transform an array of data into an array of div elements. So with map, I got an individual player. And then because this is an individual player, I can return, what do I want to do with the player? Well, let's display, for instance, the name, player.name, and let's also display the score, player.score, something like that. Right. Now, interestingly, the server died, so let's open it again. And let's see if this works or not. So, that will hopefully display 3 elements on the screen: name, score, name, score, name, score. We'll see in a minute if that works. Here you go. You see? It works. All good. Obviously, we're not going to talk about styling or things like that because this is not the scope of the session. But yeah, I hope everybody agrees that that works. So, question, can I change get data with get stuff?
Right now, no.
If I change it here, will it?
Change the name. Import as. So import data as get stuff.
No, I don't want to use as. I just want to rename line number 10, get data with get stuff. It won't work. Look, you are wrong. You are wrong, guys. It works. Why it works? What if I put here get Brexit? Yeah.
It's going to the default export.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct. That default keyword means that's the main component we are exporting. That's the main one. Because that's the main one, when we import it, it doesn't matter what we put here. That will be assigned, will have a reference to the default export. Right? So that's why, generally speaking, it's a good practice to put get data, but we can rename it if we want. But then, I have another question. What happens if, as part of the player component, I want to export another function called get number of players? Right, let me refactor that. So I create a variable called players. And then when we call get data, we return players. And get number of players. How do we get the number of players, guys? Players.length. That's correct, Natasha. Right. How do we make get number of players available to the app component? Can we do export default?
You have to mention that specifically. No.
No. That's wrong. Look. You get an error. You see at the bottom, probably you can't see anything. I'll show you. Only one default export allow per module, right? That's a very important rule in JavaScript. Only one component can have the export default. So how do we make the get number of players exportable as well? That's correct. That's correct, guys. We can do that. Export and then the function. And then, how do we import get number of players here?
It has to be literal, like a literal copy.
Comma. Like that? No. Ooh, look.
You got to put in braces if it's dual.
That's correct. Whenever the export is not the default one, we need to put the brackets, which is something you've already seen, but you probably didn't notice why we need the brackets. Right. Export default, no brackets. Normal export without default, put the brackets. Right? So let's display the number of players somewhere here. Right? So let's do number of players colon get number of players, right? And then you see it works. So any questions so far? What happens if we want to export more functions like function get name of first player? How do we get the name of the first player, guys? Players 0 dot name. That's correct, right? The way to import multiple components, multiple functions, is passing commas, right? I'm going to move that to a new line, maybe not. Okay, you can see that here, right? Inside of the curly braces, you can pass a comma-separated list of components, functions that you want to import. So now we can add another div, name of first player, right? So if we do that, right, and we fix the issue, yeah, that shouldn't open here, I believe. Here you go. Right, something is wrong. Let's have a look. We got an issue importing things. Attempted import error. Get name of first player is not exported. Look, at least the error is very explicit. What happened with get name of first player?
Typo, there's S in there.
No, we didn't export it. That's a very fundamental principle in JavaScript. If you want to import something, it needs to be public. So the author, the creator of the component, needs to explicitly export it. And now it works. Any question?
Yes, I have. So in app.js, if you would, can you go back there to app.js? On an app, if you would want to, I can see here, line number 2.
Yep.
If you would want to put that in 2 lines,
Yeah.
Where would you break it?
Yeah, that's a good question actually. So generally speaking, if you need to import multiple things, that's a bit weird, right? Because you need to keep scrolling. So there are different ways to do that. Maybe my favorite one is following JavaScript. You know in JavaScript when you put the curly brackets, then you add a new line. So we can do the same thing here, right? Look. You see? We can do something like that. And that, of course, still works, right?
What will happen if you get data as well, default as well in the curly brackets?
Say again?
What will happen
if we put get data inside of the curly brackets? Okay, let's have a look. Let's put get data inside of the curly brackets. Fails.
It's different because it's default.
Correct. You cannot do that.
default export is
Correct.
But what if you name it explicitly, like exact literal name, would it still work?
Say it again?
You know you call it get data, right? What if you call it its actual name
The actual name.
in the export?
Get
Yeah,
data.
in the actual export.
Get data is the actual name, I believe.
Oh, what is it?
Yeah.
You didn't rename it?
Yeah. No,
Okay.
I didn't rename it. So we saw before that we can rename the default one, right? Because that's the only one. So we can rename it, right, to get Brexit, and it works, right? We agree on that. Eventually it works. That's it. But now, can we rename the non-default exports? No. What happens if instead of get number of players, we put get number of Brexits? Will this work?
No.
That's correct. That doesn't work because as it's not the default, it needs to map with any specific export. So it will search, do I have a method called get number of Brexits in my player component? No. Wrong. Error. Right? Any question? Yep.
In the export, right, how many functions can we export?
You can export as many functions as you want.
But it needs to be export prefix.
Correct. You need to put the export prefix. Generally speaking, my personal suggestion, and that may sound a bit strict, but I try to have one export per file. Why? Because then, if I need to add more functionality, I will have to create a new file, right? That helps me to make sure that the size of my components remains small. One of the big issues in large-scale programming is how big files get eventually, right? If I have a 300 lines component, it may be challenging to me to maintain it. Also, we may have conflicts because if we have a big 300 lines file that I'm modifying, if someone else is modifying the same file because that's the main file, we may clash. And if we clash, that may be challenging to fix. So that's why components, the smaller, the better, right? So let's talk about aliases. So you may have noticed that, especially when talking about routing, that's number 14, 13, something like that. We did something like that. It works, right? Why we do that? There are two reasons to rename a import. Why?
Make it shorter.
To make it, okay, fair enough. Yeah, that's one reason, right? To make it shorter. If the name we're exporting is a bit long and, you know, a bit weird, okay, but there is another vital reason to rename imports. It's yeah, okay, yeah, that's the same thing, right? To keep it shorter and nicer. But there is another more important reason. Okay, I'll show you an example. What happened if, look at that. That's a classic job interview as well. If I have another component called get scores.js, and as part of get scores sports export default get number of players. Right? So in other words, I have another component that is exporting a function called get number of players. So let's display the number of players according to the get scores function, right? So we can do import. Is it default? Yeah, it's default. Get number of players. Actually, let's get rid of the default. let's assume that get scores has several functions, so then we need to put the curly braces, right? From get scores. Can anyone see the problem? That's correct. Look at what happened. We're dealing with two components that unfortunately export the same function name. There's a conflict. We may not have control on what they're exporting. Look at React. React exported something called React, exported something called component. And we don't have control on that. Because we don't have control on what each component exports. Yes, correct. Thanks to that, we can rename it. I cannot change what the imported function exports. I cannot change that. But at least I can rename it. You see? So now, even though two components export the same function, name, obviously the content may be completely different, right? But they have the same function name. I can rename one of them, so then I can use both. If I want to access the get number of players method of player.js, I call it as it is, get number of players. If I want to access the get number of players of get scores, I rename it to get players, so I'll invoke it just as get players. So now, if I display get players, you see, that returns the number exported by get scores instead of the number exported by player. Does it make sense? Yeah? Any question? Cool. Two more things for today. First of all, we're talking about exporting functions, right? But look at this example. Export default function get data. That returns the players. Can I put that here? Export default. Can I do that? Doesn't look good, right? We cannot export inline variables. What happens if I do that? Can I do that? Obviously commenting everything else. You know, we need to comment a few things now to make the example work again. So, yeah. So let me just simplify this a bit. So, right, so we got get data, and then, right. So obviously now this is not a function, that's an array, right? So we can put players here, right? You see, it works. So in other words, even though we cannot export a variable name at the time we create it, we can export whatever we want immediately, right? Export default. Can we, for example, export, let me rephrase that. So if that's the default, we can do that. But what happens if it's not default? Can we do that? Why we can't export an array if it's not the default? Because we don't know how to import it here, right? What's the name of the variable? We don't know, right? We don't know. So, in other words, when we use export default, we have more flexibility. We can, for example, export a string, right? Can we do that? Of course we can. It will fail because we are trying to iterate over a string. That doesn't make sense. But we can export default whatever we want, right? String, an object, an array, right? But if it's not default, it's not that simple. And then, if we have the variable, even though we show we cannot do export default, let players, blah, blah, that's not correct. But can we do that? Can we first create the variable and then export it in 2 steps? Right. That's completely valid, guys. Right? So that's okay. You can create a variable and then export it. Can we now get rid of the default?
I think you can.
As you can see, we can't actually. We can't. We can't because of the same reason. So export default is more flexible because with export default, you export one thing. It doesn't mind if it doesn't care if it's an object, if it's an array, if it's a function, if it's a Boolean, if it's a string. It just export one data, one thing, right? But if it's not default, rules are a bit more strict, right? So in that respect, my personal suggestion is unless you have a good reason, always export a function, right? Because then you don't have any problem. You can export a function with export default. You can export a function without export default, you know, whatever you want, right? So that's the general rule I would recommend you. Can anyone see, export default. Can anyone see another advantage? Let me solve the problem, guys. So import get date. Oh, the function is duplicated. Sorry about that. And now, why this is not working? Export default get data, and then here. Okay, let's rename it. And then that's interesting. Right, at the moment it's not working and I can't see why. So let's debug that. Oh, because that's a function, right? So we need to invoke the function, data, yes, and it works. Any question? Remember, export default, export something as it is. Without the default, you need to be a bit more specific. Can we export? Of course we can export arrow functions. So you can create a function, you can create a variable as an arrow function, get data equals, you can do it that way, right? So, let's see if we can do that inline. Yeah, still works. You see? So export default, instead of a classic function, we have an arrow function that returns the number of players, the list of players, right? So yes, it works. Voila. Any other question? No? Second? Yep.
When you say we need to be strict with export.
With what?
We need to be strict when we just put export.
Yep.
What do you mean by that?
So when we use export, like this function, we need to be careful of what do we export. We need to understand the name of the function we're exporting. Because if we don't know the name of the function we're exporting, we cannot import it. Remember, whatever goes inside of the brackets should match exactly what we're exporting. Whatever stands outside of the brackets is the default. So it doesn't matter if we don't know the name, right? What do you prefer, guys? To export a function or an array in that particular case? Why the function? It's more readable. I agree on that. I agree on that. So if we always export functions, your APIs become a bit more consistent. Because when you speak to your colleagues, they will know that you are always exporting functions. If sometimes you export a function, if sometimes you export an object, if sometimes you export an array, it could be a bit more complicated to understand your API. That's one reason, I agree on that. But the second reason is probably even more important, is flexibility. Look, if I export the list of players, the array, that's fine, it will work. That's no problem at all. But if I export a function, let's put back the classic function. So if we export a function, that means that we are invoking the function. That means that tomorrow we can easily extend the behavior of the function. We can pass arguments with a filter, for example, right? So for example, I want just to display players with mean score, right? So that means, how do we return just players with a minimum score, guys?
Math.min, isn't it?
Math.min. No, wrong.
The first one, I mean, I'll use a filter or a find. In this case, we filter.
Filter. We can use filter, right?
Yeah.
So I want to just return the players which score is player.score is at least the minimum one, right? So now our API is way more powerful because when I invoke getData, I can pass a number, for example, 50, right? You see? Just returns 2 players. If I pass 60, it returns 1 player. If I pass 80, it will return no players, right? So that's another benefit of using functions. We can customize it. How would you,
I guess from a OO design standpoint, it's also cleaner, right?
yeah, I guess, yeah, I agree on that. It's from a design point of view, your API is cleaner because it's more predictable, right? And you get ready for the future because at some point you like to customize what kind of data do you want to return. Yeah, that's correct, Bala. Yeah. And what happened if because look, if I don't pass any argument, we've broken the API, right? If I don't pass any argument, I would like to return all the players. How do we do that?
Check default value in the function.
I like that. Who said that? Was it Mo?
Yeah.
Right. Can we do that? You remember the default values, guys? That means if we don't have any minimum score, initialize it to whatever, 0. Right? So that means that indirectly we'll be returning all the values. Right? So again, as a rule of thumb, and even though there will be some exceptions, but try to always return a function in your exports, and 1 function per component. Named variables. Name, no. No, you can pass an object.
No, so what I mean is, if I had parameter A, B, C,
Yeah.
and I just only want to pass B, for example.
You need to pass an object. Yeah. We'll learn how to name variables, argument variables in modern JavaScript using object destructuring. But that will be in a future session.
For example, reduce.
Yeah. No, but this is not name variables because with reduce you need to follow a sequential order. If you want the index, you need to pass 3 arguments. You have to. Correct. But we'll learn how to minimize the impact of the problem with modern JavaScript in a future session. Cool. One more thing, guys, because we're 3 minutes out of time. So what happened if, because of whatever reason, my player method is somewhere else? For example, inside of the JavaScript folder. Right? I'm moving my dependency, and now obviously it fails. How do we fix the problem? Correct. We need to change the path, right? Player/player, right? So please be careful with the paths. So, no, not player, sorry, it's in JavaScript, I think. Yeah? Correct, it works, right? So most of the time, Visual Studio helps you. Whenever you type /, it suggests you what do you want to import, right? Where is it?
Do we have the concept of, say, for the operating system level, we have the concept of path, or class path in Java?
Class path.
Yeah, where it goes and looks for files and
No.
explicitly.
Yeah, correct. Because we start with the /, all these paths are relative. So the dot means take the current folder as a reference. In my case, the current folder of app.js is src. So I'm here. Then go to a folder called JS, Okay, now I'm here. And inside of JS, import a file called player. We got it. What happens if our file is on a parent directory? How do we access files that are on a parent directory?
Dot, dot.
Correct. With dot dot slash, we go one level up. Right? In that case, it doesn't make sense because our main file app.js is on the root folder. But in some cases, right, if we are dealing with with player.js, we may want to import a file on a parent directory. With dot dot, you can access the parent folder, right? And obviously, you can concatenate multiple dot dot. Look, I'm going very far now in my laptop, right? I'm accessing, you know, forbidden folders. But that's the way it works, right? You can climb. You can go up as many levels as you want, and then, of course, then you can go down again, you know, and find whatever you want in that folder. Generally speaking, it's considered a bad practice to do things like that, right? So if to access a component, you need to do dot dot slash dot dot slash dot dot slash, that means that your folder structure is probably a bit complex, right? But that may happen. So just bear in mind that the scenario is completely valid.
If you were packaging an application
Yeah.
to sell, for example, and you want to have a Rabbit file with different parts,
Yeah.
and then use those parts that the user defines,
Yeah.
and to import.
Yeah.
So how do we do that?
So in the backend, you mean?
Yeah, backend.
So on the backend, so the way to access files is pretty much the same. The only difference is, as we mentioned at the beginning, we cannot use import from yet, because that's not part of Node, as far as I know, not even the latest version, but that will happen shortly, right? So with Node, you may need to do let get data pseudocode equals require, and then the same path. So that will be the way you will access a file, a component using Node.js, right? I know that with Node, there is something called dir name. Probably you've seen that already. Not sure if it's capital N or lower. I don't remember that. But anyway, so dir name is an absolute reference, I believe, to the current folder. But again, that's a separate name, a separate thing. I don't want to mix things for now, right? So just bear in mind that with front-end JavaScript, and at some point shortly with back-end JavaScript as well, this is coming, this is happening, import from is the correct way to go.
Ricardo,
Yeah.
It's John in here. So maybe for after, but this is relevant, I think, to where I'm struggling on task 23.
Okay, so then let's catch up offline, Jonan, about that. Let's have a look in a minute.
Cool.
Anything else, guys?
So with duplicates, we said we could use aliases.
Correct, you can use aliases, correct.
But other tools they use for the linkers, which are the duplication.
Well, if you import to the applicated variables, the compiler will complain straight away. Yeah.
Generally, within our code,
Yeah.
we want to detect duplicates. Is there other tools and
As far as I know, I don't know. And that, to be honest, that would be very challenging. Because what are these tools going to do? Are they going to inspect the React library, all the exports of the React library, all the exports of all your dependencies? I mean, that's valid. It's not a blocking problem. It's perfectly allowed to have multiple dependencies exporting the same thing. That's valid. It's how real life is, right? Why can't I create a new component and export something called React? Of course I can. That's fine. But it's up to you, it's up to the importer to rename it, rename the duplicates using aliases. Anything else, guys? No?
is package structures typically used, say, for example, in Java or
Hmm?
for example, follow that
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
you go backwards.
Yep. Yeah, correct. Yeah, again, it's the same principle, it's the same pattern. The only difference is the syntax is different. With front-end JavaScript, we use import from. With back-end JavaScript, we use require. But the pattern is just different syntax to do the same thing. Cool. Anything else, Jonan, Richard, Jaff?
No, I'm done.
No? Cool. So that was it for today. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.